Imagine falling asleep while your breath turns to frost in the air. No heaters, no blankets fresh out of a dryer, just negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit of unforgiving Nordic winter closing in on all sides, every single night. While we panic at a broken thermostat, these legendary seafarers mastered the brutal cold using nothing but clever design, communal smarts, and sheer willpower, building an empire from within the ice. They didn't just survive, they thrived. Their homes weren't crude shelters, but finely tuned climate systems disguised as wooden buildings. Their sleep wasn't a gamble with frostbite, it was engineered resilience. As we face a future full of climate uncertainty and rising energy demands, their ancient cold weather strategies might hold more answers than you'd expect. The winter that faced Viking communities wasn't simply cold. It was an existential threat that demanded respect and preparation on a community-wide scale. In coastal Scandinavia, winter temperatures regularly plunged to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 30 degrees Celsius, with howling winds accelerating heat loss at rates that could induce hypothermia in under 30 minutes in an unprotected person. Even more challenging, these brutal conditions weren't a brief inconvenience, but a sustained reality lasting from October through April in many regions, nearly half the year spent in darkness and bitter cold. What made Viking winter nights particularly dangerous was the perfect storm of environmental factors they faced. The extended darkness of northern latitudes meant that in midwinter, sunlight might appear for just 4 to 6 hours daily in southern Scandinavia and disappear entirely above the Arctic Circle. This created a dangerous equation. Longer nights meant more hours where body temperature naturally drops during sleep, precisely when external temperatures were at their most threatening. The margin between sleep and hypothermia was razor thin. Once core body temperature dipped below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, clear thinking gave way to confusion. Drop just a few degrees more, below 91 degrees Fahrenheit, and consciousness itself began to fade. And with up to 50% of body heat lost through the head and another 30% through the limbs, every exposed inch became a liability. The Vikings didn't need modern science to understand the risks. They learned it the hard way. Water exacerbated these challenges in unexpected ways. The high humidity of coastal regions meant that cold air could steal body heat up to 25 times faster than dry air at the same temperature. Sweat from daily activities became a deadly liability at night, as moisture conducted heat away from the body far more efficiently than dry clothing or bedding. Even breathing presented a challenge. Each exhalation in extremely cold air represents a small but cumulative loss of body heat over an 8-hour sleep period. The Vikings endured it without the comforts we take for granted today. No Gore-Tex, no synthetic insulation, no electric warmth at the press of a button. Their survival depended on conserving every last calorie of body heat. This wasn't merely camping in cold weather, it was navigating a nightly tightrope walk between life and death, where sleep itself became both necessary for survival and potentially dangerous in its vulnerability. And yet, the Vikings found a way to make it work. The secret wasn't just in their sleep habits, it was built into the very structures they lived in. The Viking longhouse wasn't just an architectural style, it was a sophisticated survival machine disguised as a simple wooden structure. At first glance, these buildings appear primitive compared to modern construction, but their design incorporated an intuitive understanding of thermodynamics that modern passive house designers would recognize immediately. The typical Viking longhouse employed what engineers today would call a thermal envelope, a carefully considered barrier between the brutally cold outside world and the livable interior space. The most striking feature was the deliberate narrowness of these buildings, typically measuring just 16 to 18 feet or 5 to 6 meters wide, while stretching anywhere from 50 to 250 feet or 15 to 75 meters in length. This counterintuitive design choice minimized the surface area exposed to the elements while maximizing the interior space where heat could collect, essentially the same principle used in modern thermal flask design. The genius continued below ground level. Vikings typically dug their longhouse floors 3 to 4 feet, or 1.2 meters, below the Earth's surface, literally tapping into the planet's geothermal properties. While the surface might be locked in bitter frost, the Earth just a few feet down maintains a relatively stable temperature, around 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit in most of Scandinavia. This natural preheating provided a temperature boost of nearly 70 degrees Fahrenheit before any other warming methods were employed. Viking walls weren't just simple barriers. They were intricately designed, multi-layered systems that maximized insulation. The outer layer consisted of sturdy wooden planks, followed by a thick layer of clay mixed with straw, and then an inner wooden wall. This layered construction created dead air spaces, trapping heat effectively. Archaeological evidence suggests that in particularly cold regions, additional insulation layers of moss, animal hair, and even seaweed might be packed between these layers, creating an insulating system that could rival modern fiberglass in effectiveness. The roof design incorporated equally thoughtful elements. The steep pitch ensured that snow, a surprisingly effective insulator when not melting, would remain in place rather than sliding off. A properly snow-covered Viking longhouse roof could add an insulation layer with an estimated R value of 1.45 per inch of settled snow. In practical terms, 2 feet of accumulated snow could nearly double the roof's thermal resistance. Perhaps most ingenious was the central hearth system. Rather than placing fireplaces against exterior walls, where heat would be lost to the outside, Vikings positioned their hearths centrally along the longhouse's length. Stone slabs beneath and around these fire pits absorbed thermal energy during the evening cooking and socialization hours, then radiated this stored heat gradually throughout the night. The final component of Viking shelter design wasn't architectural, but social. Communal sleeping arrangements weren't just cultural, they were thermodynamic. By concentrating the entire household in the central sleeping area, often raised platforms running along the longhouse walls, they created a critical mass of body heat. A single sleeping human generates approximately 60 to 100 watts of heat, comparable to a small incandescent light bulb. A family of 6 to 8 people sleeping in close proximity could generate the equivalent of a 500-watt heater running continuously through the night, all without consuming any resources. But it didn't stop there. Their clothing and bedding systems were designed with the same precision, using materials that outperformed even modern gear in extreme cold. Wool formed the cornerstone of the Viking cold weather strategy, but this wasn't the scratchy, heavy wool we might imagine. Archaeological finds reveal that Viking wool was processed using techniques that created varying weights and textures, including a remarkably fine, soft variant used for items worn against the skin. What made their wool exceptional was its natural structure. Each fiber contains microscopic air pockets that trap body heat, creating insulation that functions even when wet. Modern testing of preserved Viking textiles shows they achieved insulation equivalent to modern 200 to 400 gram thinsulate, while maintaining better breathability. And while we're all out here relying on overpriced modern outdoor gear, the Vikings were layering like seasoned survivalists. Evidence suggests they typically employed 3 distinct layers: a moisture-wicking base layer, usually lightweight wool or linen, an insulating middle layer, heavier wool, sometimes doubled, and a wind-water-resistant outer layer, often wool treated with beeswax or animal fats to increase water repellency. This system created multiple heat-trapping air zones while addressing the critical challenge of moisture management. For sleeping, Vikings had it down to a science, starting with specialized night garments that kept them warm without cutting off circulation. Their most vital piece was the sleep cap, but not just any cap. These were hood-like setups that covered the head, neck, and shoulders, leaving only the face exposed. Bedding followed the same multi-layered logic. They slept on raised wooden platforms to avoid the frozen ground, piled with straw or hay for loft, then layered with sheepskins or furs, skin side down, fur side up, to wick moisture and trap heat. In brutal cold, they went full sleep system mode, the sleeper would wear wool from head to toe, including mittens and socks, then wrap in a fur-lined cloak before sliding between layers of wool blankets and furs. Then, it was into the bedding layers: wool blankets, furs, and a feather-stuffed pillow under a hood, leaving just the nose and mouth peeking out. It was primitive in appearance, but it worked with ruthless efficiency. Perhaps most impressive was their use of animal-specific materials based on their thermal properties. Reindeer fur, with its hollow hair shafts, provided the highest insulation-to-weight ratio. Seal skin, naturally water-resistant, was often used for moisture-prone areas. Bear fur, with its exceptional density and loft, frequently served as the outer layer of bedding. This wasn't just a fur fashion show. It was targeted thermoregulation through a sophisticated understanding of different materials' properties, developed through generations of trial and error in extreme conditions. However, the Vikings' approach to generating and preserving body heat throughout the frigid night wasn't simply about passive insulation. It was an active, multifaceted strategy that began long before bedtime and involved surprisingly sophisticated metabolic manipulation. The Viking pre-sleep routine started with the evening meal, carefully timed approximately 2 hours before sleep. This wasn't merely a cultural tradition, but a strategic metabolic decision. Archaeological analysis of cooking vessels and food remains reveals that winter evening meals were notably different from summer fare, higher in fats and proteins that would promote slower digestion and extended heat generation. A typical winter evening meal might include fatty fish, meat preserved in its own fat, and nutrient-dense broths that provided both hydration and calories without excessive liquid that would necessitate midnight trips outside. The composition of these meals was remarkably well suited to overnight thermogenesis, the production of heat through metabolic processes. Modern research confirms that protein digestion creates roughly 30% more thermogenic effect than carbohydrates, effectively turning the digestive system into an internal furnace that could generate heat for 6 to 8 hours after consumption. Fat metabolism, while slower to initiate, provides more sustained energy and heat output through the later portions of the night. The Vikings' protein and fat-heavy winter diet essentially programmed their bodies to generate heat precisely when they needed it most. Beverage choices played an equally important role. Evidence suggests that Vikings often consumed warm beverages containing herbs we now know to have vasodilatory effects, including meadowsweet and yarrow, which would increase blood flow to extremities before sleep. Perhaps counterintuitively, they appear to have limited evening alcohol consumption during the coldest months, despite their famous mead halls. Modern science explains why. While alcohol creates an initial sensation of warmth by dilating blood vessels near the skin, it ultimately accelerates heat loss and impairs the body's ability to regulate temperature during sleep. Physical activity immediately before sleep served as another heat-generating strategy. Archaeological evidence at multiple sites shows small confined spaces near sleeping areas with signs of high foot traffic, suggesting deliberate movement in limited areas. Essentially ancient jumping jacks or jogging in place. This brief exertion would provide a crucial temperature buffer for the first hour of sleep, when the transition from activity to rest normally causes a temperature drop. The sleeping arrangements themselves reflected sophisticated understanding of collective heat management. Viking sleeping platforms typically measured about 5 to 6 feet or 1.5 to 1.8 meters wide. Insufficient for modern personal space standards, but ideal for heat conservation. Family members would sleep in close contact, often in spoon-like arrangements where each person's chest would warm the back of the person in front of them. The youngest children, most vulnerable to cold, would typically be positioned in the center of this human formation. But even their breathing wasn't left to chance. In sub-zero temperatures, each exhale carries away precious body heat and moisture. Archaeological evidence suggests Vikings often slept with their heads slightly under covers, creating a microclimate where exhaled air would warm the small breathing pocket before being recirculated. This technique, later adopted by Arctic explorers, could raise the temperature of inhaled air by 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, significantly reducing respiratory heat loss. Just as their bedding, clothing, and breathing were adapted to the cold, so too was the very structure of their sleep. Perhaps the most significant difference between Viking winter sleep and our modern expectations was their embrace of what chronobiologists now call biphasic sleep, or segmented sleep. Historical evidence, including linguistic analysis of Old Norse terminology around sleep, suggests Vikings typically experienced two distinct sleep periods during the long winter nights, separated by a period of quiet wakefulness lasting 1 to 2 hours. Rather than fighting against this natural pattern as we modern humans often do, the Vikings incorporated it into their cultural and survival practices. The typical winter sleep schedule would begin relatively early. Archaeological evidence of lighting use suggests most Vikings would begin their first sleep phase not long after sunset, which could be as early as 3 p.m. during the depths of winter in northern regions. This first sleep would last approximately 3 to 4 hours, followed by a period of wakeful activity in the middle of the night. This midnight waking wasn't viewed as insomnia or disrupted sleep, but as a normal expected interval with specific purposes. During this time, evidence suggests Vikings would engage in several important activities. They would stoke fires that had burned down, consume small amounts of preserved food to fuel ongoing thermogenesis, check on livestock housed in adjacent sections of the longhouse, and often engage in quiet craftwork or storytelling. The second sleep would then commence and continue until sunrise, which, depending on latitude and season, might not occur until 9 or 10 a.m. in midwinter. This biphasic pattern allowed for approximately 12 to 14 total hours of sleep during the longest winter nights, significantly more than the modern average of 7 to 8 hours, but appropriately aligned with the extended darkness. Modern research supports this pattern as a smart adaptation. Longer sleep during extreme cold helps the body recover from the constant work of staying warm. Similar sleep habits are still seen today in Arctic indigenous communities, not as hibernation, but as a natural response to environmental stress and limited daylight. Beyond their impressive technological and behavioral adaptations, the Viking populations themselves exhibited physiological characteristics that enhanced their capacity to endure extreme cold during sleep. Biological adaptations that emerged over generations of natural selection in one of Earth's most challenging thermal environments. The most significant physiological difference appears in their metabolic function. Skeletal analysis from Viking burial sites reveals bone density and muscle attachment patterns consistent with what modern medicine identifies as high thermogenic capacity, essentially an enhanced ability to generate internal heat. This wasn't magic, but a combination of several adaptations that collectively created more efficient cold weather humans. Studies of modern Scandinavians, many of whom carry Viking ancestry, shed light on how their bodies coped with cold during sleep. A key factor is the abundance of brown fat, which, unlike regular fat, burns energy to generate heat. People from colder regions tend to have more of it, particularly around the neck and shoulders, precisely where warmth is most needed during sleep. In freezing conditions, this brown fat acts like a mini space heater, producing heat without the need for shivering or waking. Their circulatory systems also show remarkable cold response capabilities. Viking remains indicate they had an enhanced ability to reduce blood flow to extremities while maintaining warmth in the core, an essential survival strategy for enduring icy nights without losing fingers or toes. Perhaps most impressive is their nervous system's adaptation to cold. Modern northern populations often report less discomfort in low temperatures, suggesting that their bodies don't perceive the cold as a threat, which minimizes sleep disruptions. Combined with larger nasal passages that warm air more efficiently, these features helped fine-tune their bodies, not just to survive in harsh conditions, but for deep, restorative sleep even in the coldest environments.
Think your winter is brutal? While you're curled up with hot chocolate and the thermostat humming at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, Viking peasants braced for a Scandinavian deep freeze armed with nothing but wool, firewood, and sheer survival instinct. Every autumn was a race against death. One mistake in their preparations meant starvation, frostbite, or worse. No second chances, no safety nets. Just months of brutal labor, communal survival, and wisdom forged through generations of hardship. Compared to their world, scraping ice off your windshield is child's play. So how did they outlast the deadliest season with nothing but grit and ancient know-how? The first thing that struck Viking peasants wasn't the cold, it was the darkness. In central Scandinavia, winter days shrank to a mere 4 to 6 hours of pale, watery sunlight. Imagine spending 18 to 20 hours in near-total darkness, where every task, from feeding livestock to collecting firewood, had to be accomplished in a narrow window of twilight. For context, that's like trying to complete all your daily activities during an extended lunch break. But the darkness was just the opening act. Winter temperatures in Viking Age Scandinavia regularly plunged to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 29 degrees Celsius, with coastal regions facing the added bite of wind chill and maritime storms. To put this in perspective, that's cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 30 minutes, about the same temperature as the inside of your home freezer. Modern weather stations in these regions still record similar temperatures, but we face them with Gore-Tex and central heating, not homespun wool and wooden walls. The winter presented 3 lethal challenges that every Viking household had to overcome. First was the cold itself, an invisible predator that could kill through hypothermia or frostbite. Without reliable shelter and heating, death could come in a single night of exposure. Second was starvation. Unlike our modern world of 24/7 supermarkets, Vikings faced months where growing food was impossible. Their autumn preparations needed to be perfect, or spring would find their households decimated by hunger. Third was isolation. Winter storms could cut off Viking communities for weeks at a time. A family that ran out of food or fuel couldn't simply trek to the nearest village for supplies. Attempting such a journey in a blizzard was often a death sentence. For Viking peasants, surviving winter wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about preparing for a siege by nature itself. Every autumn became a race against time to gather enough resources to survive nature's harshest season. Their solutions to these challenges weren't just clever, they were essential blueprints for survival that would be passed down through generations. If you've ever had your power go out and worried about the food in your freezer, you've had a tiny taste of what Viking peasants faced every year. But while we panic about a few days of food storage, they had to preserve enough food to feed entire families and their livestock for up to 6 months. Their solutions weren't just effective, they were ingenious combinations of chemistry and careful timing that we still use today. The preservation process began long before the first frost. By late summer, Viking households launched into a carefully choreographed dance of food preservation that would make modern preppers look like amateurs. Every edible item had its own preservation method, perfected through generations of trial and error. Meat preservation was perhaps their most sophisticated achievement. Without refrigeration, Vikings developed a multi-layered approach that would seem almost alchemical to modern eyes. Fish and meat were first dried in the cold autumn air, then smoked using specific types of wood. A typical Viking household would smoke enough meat to fill a modern walk-in closet, roughly 600 to 800 pounds or 270 to 360 kilos for a family of 6. The smoking process wasn't just about preservation. It created a protective outer layer that sealed in nutrients while keeping out bacteria. But their most fascinating preservation method was fermentation. Take skyr, for instance, a dairy product that's currently trending in high-end grocery stores, but was a Viking survival staple. By carefully controlling bacterial fermentation, they created a protein-rich food that could last months without refrigeration. Modern food scientists have found that traditional skyr contains beneficial probiotics that actually strengthen the immune system, something those Viking peasants seem to know intuitively. The real masterpiece of Viking food preservation was their root cellar system. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were sophisticated temperature control devices that maintained a steady 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 to 4 degrees Celsius, nearly identical to your modern refrigerator. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and rutabagas were layered between sand and straw in these cellars, creating a natural crisper drawer that could keep vegetables fresh for months. A typical Viking root cellar could store enough vegetables to provide 2,000 to 2,500 calories per person per day throughout the winter. Grains posed another challenge entirely. Vikings learned that properly dried grain could last through winter without spoiling, but the drying process had to be perfect. Too much moisture meant mold. Too little meant the grain would be too hard to process. They built specialized drying racks that allowed them to control this process with remarkable precision, creating stores of grain that could last not just through winter, but sometimes for several years. Their version of a long-term emergency fund. The preservation process wasn't just about keeping food from spoiling. It was about maintaining enough nutritional diversity to keep people healthy through the dark months. Every preserved food item was part of a carefully planned nutritional strategy that provided proteins, carbohydrates, and enough vitamins to ward off deficiency diseases. Modern nutritionists have found that this preserved food diet, while monotonous by our standards, was surprisingly well balanced. Think of your home as a machine for keeping warm, and you'll begin to understand how Vikings approached shelter design. The longhouse wasn't just a building, it was a sophisticated environmental control system that would make modern sustainable architects nod in appreciation. These structures, typically measuring 50 to 80 feet or 15 to 24 meters in length, were masterpieces of thermal engineering disguised as simple wooden halls. The first surprise about longhouses was their roommates. If you think sharing a house with pets is intimate, Viking families lived with their entire livestock collection. Before you wrinkle your nose, consider the brilliance of this arrangement. A single cow produces roughly the same heat as a small modern space heater, about 1,000 BTUs per hour. A typical Viking longhouse might house 4 to 6 cows, several sheep, and other animals, essentially creating a living heating system that required no fuel beyond the feed they already needed to provide. The building's design maximized this heat capture through a principle modern architects call passive solar design. The long axis of the house typically ran east to west, with the main door facing south. This orientation allowed the low winter sun to penetrate deep into the building, while the steep pitched roof minimized heat loss. The roof design wasn't just about shedding snow. It created a thermal envelope that trapped rising warm air and radiated it back downward. But the real genius was in the walls. Vikings developed a sophisticated insulation system that would look familiar to modern green builders. The outer walls were typically built with a technique called skiftisverk, thick wooden planks fitted between vertical posts. Between these walls, they packed a dense layer of insulating material, moss, straw, and even sheep's wool. Modern testing of reconstructed walls shows they achieved an insulation value comparable to a modern home's fiberglass-filled walls. The central hearth was the heart of this indoor ecosystem. Unlike modern fireplaces that send most of their heat up the chimney, Viking hearths were designed for maximum heat retention. The smoke hole in the roof was carefully sized to maintain what we now call the stack effect, creating just enough draft to clear smoke while minimizing heat loss. The stone-lined hearth itself acted as a thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and radiating it back at night, much like modern solar heat storage systems. The floor plan followed what we'd now call zoned heating. The central area around the hearth was the main living space, while storage areas were positioned at the cooler ends of the building. Sleeping platforms were typically raised and built along the walls, keeping people above the coldest air that settled at floor level. Perhaps most ingeniously, Vikings created what we might call the first airlock entries. Many longhouses had a small antechamber at the entrance, creating a buffer zone that prevented heat loss every time someone entered or left. This feature, which we now see in modern cold climate architecture, helped maintain the delicate thermal balance they worked so hard to achieve. Before Gore-Tex and synthetic fleece, Vikings had perfected a clothing system so effective that modern Arctic explorers still follow many of its principles. Their approach to cold weather clothing wasn't just about piling on layers, it was a sophisticated system that managed moisture, regulated temperature, and protected against wind while allowing enough mobility to work. The foundation of Viking cold weather wear was wool, but not the itchy sweater your grandmother knitted. Viking wool processing was a year-round task that produced a textile with properties that modern synthetics still struggle to match. Their sheep, smaller and hardier than modern breeds, produced two distinct types of wool: a soft, insulating undercoat and longer, water-resistant outer fibers. Through careful processing, Viking textile workers could create fabrics that combine the benefits of both. Imagine a natural version of modern two-layer ski gear. The Viking layering system would look familiar to any modern mountaineer. The base layer, or undertunics, were made from finely woven wool that wickeded moisture away from the skin. Unlike modern polyester base layers that can get smelly, wool naturally resists bacterial growth. Tests on reconstructed Viking wool garments show they could absorb up to 30% of their weight in moisture without feeling wet, roughly twice what modern synthetic base layers can handle. The middle layer consisted of thicker wool garments, often including the iconic Viking wool tunic. These were designed with a loose weave that created thousands of tiny air pockets, the same principle used in modern fleece jackets. A typical middle layer tunic could trap enough air to provide insulation equivalent to a modern 200-weight fleece. The outer layer was where Viking ingenuity really shone. They created water-resistant cloaks using a technique called vadmal, a heavily fulled wool that was almost felt-like in density. These cloaks, often treated with animal fats for additional waterproofing, could shed snow and light rain while still allowing body moisture to escape. Modern tests show these cloaks perform similarly to mid-range modern shell jackets in terms of water resistance. As for their winter boots, they came with a clever trick: removable wool insoles. Dry them by the fire overnight, and you'd wake up to warm feet, ready for another brutal day. Their leg bindings? Strips of wool wrapped snug around the lower legs, adjustable for warmth and mobility, centuries ahead of modern gaiters. The most surprising aspect of Viking cold weather gear was its sophistication in handling the greatest challenge of winter clothing: managing moisture. Modern winter athletes know that sweat can be deadlier than cold. Once moisture freezes in your clothing, you're wearing an ice vest. Vikings solved this through careful garment design that included ventilation options. Their tunics often had front slits that could be opened during heavy work and closed for warmth during rest periods, the medieval equivalent of modern pit zips. The harsh reality was that no single household, no matter how well prepared, could guarantee their winter survival alone. The Vikings' greatest innovation wasn't in their tools or techniques. It was in their sophisticated social networks that turned individual vulnerability into collective resilience. The foundation of Viking winter survival was the Granlag, neighborhood groups that functioned like ancient mutual aid societies. These weren't just informal arrangements, they were binding social contracts. Each household in a Granlag had specific responsibilities and rights. Think of it as a medieval insurance policy where the premium was paid in labor and resources rather than money. Winter preparation began as a community effort long before the first frost. The Vikings had a system called dugnad, communal work days, where entire communities would gather to help each other prepare. Imagine your whole neighborhood showing up to help you stock your winter supplies, repair your roof, and ensure your heating system was ready. These weren't just helpful gestures, they were crucial survival strategies. A single household might take weeks to process their winter food stores, but a community working together could complete the task in days. The Vikings developed sophisticated food sharing systems that would impress modern economists. Each community maintained communal storage houses called burj, where surplus food was stored. These weren't just warehouses, they were carefully managed resources that could be drawn upon if a family's supplies ran low. The system wasn't charity, it was a complex web of obligations and rights that ensured everyone's survival. Despite the brutal conditions, entertainment was essential, a survival tactic often overlooked by historians. Long winter nights weren't just endured, they were filled with veternatter, gatherings that went far beyond mere celebration. These weren't just parties, they were lifelines. A time to share news, reinforce social bonds, and battle the crushing isolation of winter. Around the fire, stories were passed down, crucial skills were taught, and the wisdom of generations ensured that survival wasn't just physical, but psychological too. The community also maintained winter roads, packed snow paths between settlements that were literally kept open by a collective effort. Each household was responsible for maintaining their section of these paths, creating a transportation network that could mean the difference between life and death during emergencies. Most remarkably, these community systems were self-regulating. Social pressure and the harsh reality of winter created a culture where cooperation wasn't just encouraged, it was essential for survival. Households that failed to contribute to community efforts found themselves subtly excluded from social gatherings and support networks, creating a powerful incentive for participation. The Vikings didn't just survive winter, they mastered it. Their resilience wasn't just about tools, but about community, turning survival into an art form. In an age of climate challenges, their legacy reminds us, true strength comes from working together. Maybe it's time we learn from them.
Think your morning commute is rough? Your ancestors from just 1,000 years ago would laugh at what you consider hardship. Let's imagine you've been transported to a coastal Viking settlement circa 850 CE. Your survival clock starts now. You awaken before dawn in a smoke-filled longhouse on a straw-filled sack crawling with fleas and lice, already feasting on your skin. The temperature hovers just above freezing as the hearth fire died down hours ago. Your only climate control, layers of rough-spun wool that feels like sandpaper. That persistent itch is just the beginning of what could become infected sores without proper treatment. But here's the part no one saw coming. Your morning routine doesn't involve scrolling through social media. There's no bathroom to stumble into, no hot shower to wash away your grogginess. Instead, you'd venture outside in pre-dawn darkness to relieve yourself in a designated area that's uncomfortably close to living quarters. Toilet paper? Non-existent. Think moss, leaves, or smooth stones instead. And that minty fresh feeling would be replaced with scraping your teeth using a frayed twig, maybe with some abrasive ashes if you're fancy. Your mouth would still taste foul because, bacterially speaking, it probably is. Breakfast offers no comfort either, just a bowl of reheated barley gruel, perhaps with bits of intensely salty preserved fish. The water looks suspicious, teeming with microorganisms your pampered immune system has never met. One sip could mean dysentery within hours. Even the morning ale, safer than water, would taste sour and flat to your modern palate. By now your body is in revolt, caffeine withdrawal, headaches pounding, stomach questioning your choices, joints aching from your medieval sleeping arrangement. But there's no calling in sick in Viking society, no paid time off. Unless you're physically incapacitated, you work. Morning labour won't involve emails or meetings, but back-breaking physical tasks. Chopping wood, hauling water, tending animals, or agricultural work that would leave your soft hands blistered before midday. And if you think that's bad, just wait. All this assumes your settlement isn't under attack. Vikings lived where violence wasn't a distant threat, but everyday reality. The morning calm could shatter instantly with approaching enemies, leaving seconds to react in a world where combat wasn't optional, but essential. Your knowledge of spreadsheets won't help you wield an axe against someone who's been training since childhood. In Viking times, being unprepared for violence wasn't just a disadvantage, it was a death sentence. You've made it to midday, your modern muscles screaming in protest from the morning's labour. Now comes what should be a relief, mealtime. But if you're anticipating a comforting lunch break, you're in for another brutal awakening. Viking sustenance was about survival, not satisfaction, and the distance between their food practices and your local bistro spans more than just centuries. The midday meal, if you're fortunate, consists of more of that morning gruel, though perhaps with additions that would make your modern stomach turn. Imagine biting into bread so coarse and gritty it wears down your teeth with every chew. The grain wasn't just minimally processed, it often contained particles of millstone. That strange tang, not artisanal sourdough culture, but the early stages of mold that couldn't be wasted in a society where starvation loomed every winter. The meat, when available, wouldn't be the neatly trimmed portions from your grocery store, but tough, stringy cuts from animals that lived hard lives, often preserved through smoking or brining to a saltiness that would make your blood pressure skyrocket. If you're squeamish about looking your dinner in the eye, Viking cuisine would be your personal nightmare. Nothing, absolutely nothing, goes to waste. Blood collected from slaughtered animals becomes the base for black pudding. Organs that modern Americans discard are prized delicacies. That stew bubbling in the pot might contain sheep's head, complete with eyes that are considered particularly nutritious. And let's not even discuss what passes for sausage casings. Your modern sensibilities about food would mark you as wasteful at best, possibly insulting to your hosts at worst. You're probably wondering how anyone could possibly stay properly nourished on such fare. The truth is, many didn't. Seasonal vitamin deficiencies were common, especially in winter and spring when fresh produce was non-existent. Scurvy, with its bleeding gums and reopening of old wounds, was a regular visitor to Viking communities before spring greens emerged. That slightly nauseating fermented fish you're being offered, it's not just a delicacy, it's survival, providing precious nutrients during the barren months when fresh food is impossible to find. Your reluctance to eat it might be the difference between life and death when winter stretches longer than expected. And then there's the constant uncertainty. Modern humans have forgotten what true food insecurity feels like. Your Viking hosts live with the knowledge that one bad harvest, one cattle disease, one lengthy storm preventing fishing vessels from launching could mean starvation for the entire community. The food storage areas aren't just conveniences, they're survival chambers, carefully managed and fiercely protected. That anxiety about food sufficiency permeates every aspect of Viking life, creating a relationship with sustenance entirely foreign to your supermarket psychology. In their world, the luxury of being a picky eater doesn't exist. Unless you're among the settlement's elite, portions are determined by your value to the community. That scrawny kid getting a larger share than you, he's the blacksmith's apprentice, essential to the community's survival. Your modern indignation about fairness in food distribution would be met with blank stares or outright hostility. In Viking society, your worth is measured in practical contribution, not abstract notions of equality. And if food becomes truly scarce, those deemed least valuable eat last, if at all. If you've managed to choke down enough unfamiliar food to keep moving, your survival clock continues ticking into the afternoon. But in Viking society, the greatest threat to your continued existence isn't the food or the working conditions. It's other humans. The popular image of Vikings as warriors isn't just historical stereotyping. It reflects a fundamental truth about their world where violence wasn't an aberration, but a constant companion. Let's be uncomfortably honest. You, the modern human, have probably never experienced true violence. Maybe you've seen a bar fight or witnessed a heated argument, but the visceral life or death combat that was commonplace in Viking society, that's as foreign to you as smartphones would be to them. From childhood, Vikings were conditioned not just to accept violence, but to excel at it. Boys as young as 12 trained with weapons daily, not as sport, but as essential life preparation. That teenager carrying an axe isn't playing at being an adult. He's already expected to defend the settlement if raiders appear on the horizon. And those raiders weren't rare occurrences, but a persistent reality. Coastal settlements lived in perpetual readiness for attack, not just from rival Viking groups, but from anyone with a boat and desperation or greed as motivation. The concept of peace as we understand it, the default state occasionally interrupted by conflict, would be reversed in Viking consciousness. Potential conflict was the default, with periods of relative calm as the welcome exception. Your modern instinct to flee from danger rather than toward it would mark you as a liability in a world where every able body was expected to grab a weapon when the alarm sounded. But you know what's worse than the external threats? The internal ones. That seemingly friendly Viking who shared his ale with you this morning. He's measuring your worth, your weakness, your potential usefulness. Disputes between community members weren't settled through passive-aggressive emails or HR interventions, but through direct confrontation, often escalating to holmgang, a form of regulated duel used to settle everything from property disputes to insults. Your modern conflict avoidance strategies would be interpreted as weakness, making you a target rather than keeping you safe. That's if you're a man. If you're a woman, different but equally brutal rules apply. While Viking women had more rights than many of their contemporaries in other societies, physical strength and willingness to use violence remained cultural currencies. Female Vikings needed to defend themselves and their property when men were away raiding, creating a society where even women possessed combat skills that would humble most modern men. Your inability to wield a shield or knife with confidence would make you vulnerable regardless of your gender. Even social gatherings contain potential death sentences for the unwary modern human. Those drinking horns being passed around the evening fire aren't filled with light beer, but potent mead or ale, consumed in quantities that would incapacitate the untrained modern liver. Yet maintaining awareness remains essential, because intoxication doesn't excuse you from the complex social rules governing honor and insult. One misinterpreted comment, one cultural faux pas, and you could find yourself facing a very sober Viking demanding satisfaction for an offense you didn't even realize you committed, and refusing such a challenge. That's not avoiding conflict. It's guaranteeing your status as a social outcast, denied the community protection that stands between survival and death. If you've survived the violence and managed not to fatally offend anyone, you're now facing the microscopic world of disease and infection that decimated pre-modern populations. Vikings lacked not just antibiotics, but the entire framework of germ theory that protects you daily. That small cut from afternoon chores. In your world, it's a minor inconvenience. In Viking Norway, it's potentially fatal. Without antibiotics, even tiny injuries frequently developed into life-threatening infections. The reddening skin around that cut isn't just inflammation. It's possibly the beginning of blood poisoning that can kill within days. Viking herbal treatments against serious infection were like fighting forest fires with water pistols. The sanitation situation is equally dire. Viking settlements had designated waste areas, but nothing approaching modern standards. Human and animal waste accumulated near living spaces, creating perfect breeding grounds for parasites and disease. Those stomach cramps might be from intestinal worms that would constitute a public health emergency today. Treatment? More suspicious ale while your body fights a battle it's never trained for. Despite stereotypes of filthy barbarians, Vikings actually valued cleanliness more than many European contemporaries. Cold comfort, considering what that meant. Your communal bath would involve sharing water with multiple family members, perhaps with herbs for scent rather than sanitization. And that throbbing toothache? Dental care consisted primarily of extraction without anesthesia, using tools more suited to a torture chamber. Healing fell to the community's wise women or men, whose treatments blended practical herbalism with rituals that would seem entirely superstitious today. Question this approach, and you're rejecting the cosmological framework ordering their world. By nightfall, new symptoms emerge from your Viking day. Smoke from the hearth has left your eyes irritated, your lungs burning with each breath. The unfamiliar bacterial environment has your stomach churning and skin breaking out in mysterious rashes. Your blistered hands already show signs of infection. In your time, each condition warrants medical attention. Here, they're simply baseline existence, unremarkable to anyone but you. As darkness falls on your first, possibly last day in Viking society, you confront perhaps the most relentless opponent, the Nordic environment itself. These people survived not because their environment was forgiving, but because they possessed generations of knowledge that you entirely lack. In Scandinavian winter, your situation would be immediately dire. Modern humans experience cold by choice and in controlled doses. Vikings experienced it as an existential threat requiring constant management. The evening temperature isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Your body, accustomed to central heating and technical fabrics, can't regulate temperature efficiently here. That uncontrollable shivering, it's the first stage of hypothermia. Your provided clothing, rough wool and animal skins, is drastically different from anything you've worn. The wool retains warmth even when wet, crucial in damp Nordic climate, but irritates skin accustomed to cotton. Those drafty seams aren't manufacturing defects, but the limits of hand stitching. Your constant fidgeting marks you as someone lacking the mental discipline to accept physical discomfort as default. Even in summer, you'd face different but equally challenging conditions. Extended northern daylight would disrupt your circadian rhythms, causing sleep deprivation. The sudden insect profusion would introduce pathogens your body has never encountered. Those picturesque landscapes, filled with hazards requiring experienced navigation, your city-trained eyes would miss crucial environmental indicators that Viking children recognize instinctively. Summer also means brutal work schedules that your 40-hour workweek body isn't prepared for. Vikings worked until daylight or the task was exhausted, up to 16-hour days of continuous physical labor. Your concept of work-life balance would be incomprehensible in a society where survival required maximizing every productive moment. The resulting exhaustion would impact your cognitive function, making errors likely precisely when they could be fatal. As night falls, environmental challenges transform rather than diminish. The seemingly sturdy longhouse reveals its vulnerabilities. Wind finds every construction gap. The necessary smoke hole allows in precipitation. The fire creates heat zones, requiring knowledge of optimal sleeping positions you lack. And the darkness is complete in a way few modern humans ever experience, filled with sounds your urban-trained ears cannot properly interpret. As your first Viking day ends, you face perhaps the most subtle yet inescapable challenge, navigating a social structure operating on entirely foreign principles. Vikings didn't just live differently, they thought differently, valuing concepts that would bewilder modern sensibilities. Your life in a society that at least honors equality, theoretical social mobility, and individual rights would clash with Viking reality. Their world operated on a rigid hierarchy where worth came from birth, strength, and practical contribution, not education or credentials. Your degree, worthless. Your personal brand, meaningless. Your assets back home, non-existent. In one day, you've fallen from whatever status you held to the absolute bottom. A useless outsider with no family connections, no demonstrable skills, and no survival knowledge. The depth of this reset is profound. In Viking society, slaves were property, not people. Without demonstrating immediate value, you'd be somewhere between tolerated burden and potential thrall. That Viking who showed basic kindness, it might have been assessing your market value if you need to be sold to another settlement. Gender roles would further shock your sensibilities. While Viking women had more rights than many contemporaries, clear labor divisions existed. Men showing interest in female tasks faced ridicule. Women who couldn't efficiently manage household production were failing their core social function. Your awkward attempts at gender-appropriate activities would mark you as deficient, regardless of your sex. Even casual interactions are minefields. Viking communication valued directness over diplomacy, unlike your workplace politeness. Your constructive feedback would seem weak and evasive. Your respectful disagreement would read as confusion or cowardice, and humor to diffuse tension. Comedy doesn't translate across millennia, and your clever reference might be taken as a grave insult. Religious views present perhaps the most dangerous territory. Viking spirituality wasn't optional, but a fundamental framework explaining everything from weather to illness. Religious rituals weren't cultural activities, but essential functions ensuring divine favor. Your reluctance to participate wouldn't be respected as personal choice, but condemned as endangering the settlement's relationship with survival-controlling forces. By the time you return to your flea-infested pallet, your social isolation becomes clear. You lack not just physical skills, but the entire cultural framework for functioning in this society. The subtle cues and shared references you navigate effortlessly at home are replaced by equally complex but different ones everyone else understands instinctively. In a world where communal support isn't just socially desirable but essential for survival, being the perpetual outsider isn't just lonely, it's potentially fatal. The painful truth is this: you wouldn't last 24 hours in Viking times because survival then required an entirely different skill set than modern life has given you. From the moment you woke on that uncomfortable straw mattress to your final, exhausted collapse at night's end, every aspect of Viking existence would be testing capabilities you've never developed. Yet somehow, These fierce northerners not only survived, but thrived in conditions that would break most of us within a single day. What were their secrets? In our next video, we'll discover the forgotten survival tactics Vikings employed that weren't just clever, but essential adaptations forged through generations of harsh experience.